Picture this. The clash of axes has ended. The shield wall is broken. Smoke curls into the sky above a ruined monastery. Dozens of warriors lie lifeless in the mud, their pain silenced forever. But for those who survived, the wives, the daughters, the women dragged from their homes, the true nightmare was only beginning. We imagine Vikings as raiders and warriors, but what came after the battle rarely makes it into the sagas. When the looting was done and the churches burned, the plunder the Norse valued most was not gold or silver. It was flesh, living flesh. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden realities of Viking and Norse history, the stories rarely told in classrooms but preserved in chronicles, archaeology, and rumor, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep unearthing these forgotten voices. Back to the story. In the year 821, the monastery of Clonmacnois fell to the Viking warlord Thorgils. 43 monks were slain defending the altar. The chronicler's ink records the massacre in a few sentences, but then falls silent about what befell the women. Archaeology fills that silence. Excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay, the very hub of Norse power in Ireland, uncovered the evidence. Iron shackles shaped for women's wrists, ankle rings small enough for children, and timber storehouses used not for grain, but for human cargo. Dublin became one of the largest slave markets in northern Europe, and the Viking fleets its suppliers. A captured wife was not a person in their eyes, but a commodity. Runic inscriptions from Schleswig even record the cold calculations of price: 20 silver coins for a young woman, 15 for a mother, 10 for one wounded in capture. These weren't guesses or rumors. They were receipts in stone, and sometimes to be sold was the best fate. The Irish annals of 862 describe a raid on Portmarnock, 47 warriors killed, but 53 women taken. The text ends there, but the ground still remembers. Soil analysis from nearby bogs revealed 23 female bodies, each showing deliberate violence. Their skulls were caved in from behind, ribs broken from prolonged assault, forearms fractured where they had raised their hands in futile defense. These weren't battlefield wounds. They were executions carried out days after the raid, once decisions had been made about who would live and who would not. This was not chaos. It was system. The Vikings harvested not only wealth but women, sorting them as spoils, as chattel, as property. The war band's victory was measured not just in plunder, but in how many living captives could be processed. And the silence of the sagas speaks louder than words. By the mid-9th century, the Viking world was more than war bands. It had rules, laws that shaped the treatment of captives. And when it came to women, those laws were brutally clear. Take the Icelandic Grágás law codes. These dusty texts, written centuries later but reflecting older practice, spelled out how a slain warrior's wife was to be claimed. She became the property of her husband's killer. The word was kona, an owned woman, a breathing possession. The ritual was chilling in its simplicity. The captor had 3 days to declare ownership before witnesses. If he failed, rivals could contest the claim. To the Norse, this was not rape. It was marriage, legal, recognized. Any children born of it were legitimate in the eyes of law and gods. Archaeological traces confirm these practices weren't just legal theory. In 871, the so-called Great Heathen Army captured Reading. Chroniclers note King Ethelred's defeat, but omit what became of the women of his household. Excavations at the Saxon palace site told the unspoken story. stones stained with iron oxide, residue from blood enough for dozens of deaths. Other cases are even darker. In 878, Norse raiders destroyed Bangor Monastery. Annals record its burning, but archaeology reveals bone fragments arranged in deliberate patterns. This was ritual. To the Vikings, captives weren't only plunder, they were sacrifice. Eyewitnesses confirm it. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling among the Rus in 921, described a funeral in which a slave girl was forced into the grave of her dead master. She was drugged with henbane, raped by his companions, and then strangled before being placed beside his corpse. It horrified him, but archaeology proves it was not an isolated event. Boat burials across Scandinavia have yielded female skeletons bearing strangulation marks, drug residues in teeth, and fractures from restraint. For the Norse, women were not simply victims of war. They were part of the ritual fabric of war itself. To kill a warrior was to claim his wife. To bury a warrior was to bury women with him, and in both cases, the logic was the same. Women were property, woven into the honor and afterlife of men. These customs were not hidden. They were codified, witnessed, repeated, and for those who survived them, life was captivity. But captivity, too, had its horrors. With the end of the Viking civil wars under King Harald Fairhair, raids did not vanish. They became more organized. The plunder was no longer chaotic, but scheduled. And at the heart of this system was the slave trade. Merchants advertised captives like livestock. Byzantine records of the Rus-Byzantine Treaty of 944 list categories of slaves, prices attached like items in a ledger. Young women commanded the highest value. Pregnant women sold at a discount. Children under 10 were worth little at all. These weren't distant exaggerations. Archaeology confirms the infrastructure. Every major Viking settlement had holding pens. Every harbor had processing sites, chains sized for children, shackles for wrists, pens built from timber, with iron anchors to fix restraints. The system was deliberate, industrial. In 937, after the decisive Battle of Brunanburh, Irish allies uncovered the baggage train of a defeated Norse force. What they found shocked them. Portable breeding pens, wooden frameworks with modular sections designed to restrain humans on the march. Each could hold a dozen adults or 20 children. Wear patterns show they were used constantly. These weren't temporary cages. They were mobile slave markets carried into battle. The purpose was simple: to process captives on the move, to keep the flow of flesh unbroken. The sagas remain silent, but the bones do not. Excavations at Jorvik, uncovered the remains of a stone building with 64 individual cells, chains bolted into the walls. Soil analysis showed the building was used for decades. Hundreds of women passed through, their bones marked by repeated pregnancies, their lives ending once they could no longer bear children. It was not hidden. The building stood at the center of the city. Church records from York confirm hundreds of births listed as foundlings. Only a handful survived past infancy. The rest vanished, sold, discarded, erased. The prophets funded church projects, even construction of York Minster itself. The partnership was chilling. Vikings supplied bodies, the church processed and profited. This was not random cruelty. This was an economy. If trade was the logic of Viking captivity, terror was its weapon. To control captives, brutality had to be visible, unforgettable. And so the Norse crafted rituals of punishment designed not merely to kill, but to teach. In Dublin, soil cores from execution pits reveal slow deaths. Bodies buried alive but not fully. Shallow pits allowed air, but no escape. Some captives died of thirst, others of cold. Some pits contained sharp stones meant to tear flesh, others shallow water to drown the victim slowly. The lesson was clear: defy your captors, and your death will be agony. Ritual sacrifice reinforced this message. At Repton, mass graves of women show repeated burials over 50 years. These were not the results of a single massacre, but systematic purges. Mothers and children buried together, their bones bearing traces of mercury poisoning. Administered slowly, mercury drove victims into madness before death. A mad woman's testimony carried no weight, her screams discredited even as they echoed across the camp. And then there were the runic inscriptions. One skull unearthed at Repton bore the words carved in Old Norse, "Better this way." A chilling justification, perhaps written by the very hands that carried out the execution. This was not random savagery. It was psychological warfare. Captives forced to watch as women were broken knew exactly what awaited them. Resistance became unthinkable. The Viking raids weren't just raids, they were harvests, and the women weren't simply casualties. They were the prize, the currency, the warning. So, what remains of these stories? Chronicles often fall silent. Sagas avoid the subject. Official records erase it. But the earth does not lie. Bones, chains, inscriptions, soil residues, they speak where ink will not. And what they reveal is a system as deliberate as any economy of the medieval world. The Vikings didn't merely plunder treasures. They harvested people. Women became property, sacrifices, and currency of empire. Their suffering was codified in law, sanctified in ritual, and traded across seas. For the women themselves, little remains. Their names are lost, their voices silenced. A few annals hint at them, a few runes mark their price, but most rest only as bones, testifying to a reality more brutal than any saga dared to describe. And yet, their silence shaped the Viking world. It built cities like Dublin and York. It fueled trade routes to Byzantium. It even laid the financial foundations of churches that later condemned pagan cruelty. The system was thorough, organized, devastating. The next time you hear of Viking courage or Norse adventure, remember the hidden story beneath it. Remember the portable pens, the shackles, the graves filled with women whose only crime was survival. Remember that the saga of conquest was written in blood, not just of warriors, but of mothers and daughters erased from memory. History is not only the story of kings and battles, it is also the story of those who suffered unseen. And in the case of the Vikings, their greatest victims were not their enemies on the battlefield, but the women who lived through the raid. Perhaps that is why the sagas are silent. Some truths were too dark even for them,